I think that the pandemic really worsened already underlying things, right? So many people already experience mental health concerns, and with the pandemic, it only made them worse. We're social people, we're social beings, we need people. And so being isolated and concerned about all these things really brought out a lot of ugly in our own mental health.
So, yeah, I really appreciate that you said that the pandemic in some ways amplified existing challenges or inequalities, and that, for example, people who had those underlying health conditions or maybe had tighter finances to start with or had more significant challenges with childcare options at the beginning, that just really became worse with the pandemic. And that we know that there were a lot of people who had depression and anxiety and other mental health issues before. And this, it certainly made things worse. In addition to the anticipatory worry about what might happen, a lot of times the worst case scenario did happen to people, right? And I've known people that passed away from COVID, and it's hard to imagine anybody who didn't know somebody or know someone who knew someone who lost a loved one. And so that grief and loss really compounded it and was really significant, I think. And all of that wrapped up kind of leads to that trauma response. And that for many people, it was a traumatic time, maybe a slow moving trauma, right? Not necessarily one specific thing that happened other than perhaps losing a loved one, but the combination of all these different things happening was really difficult for people. And I think that that's valid. It's normal and human to have these emotional responses to such upheaval and stress and uncertainty.
Absolutely. And I think that something by touching on grief and loss, that was that's a big topic to unpack, right? And the impact that it has on mental health. And knowing that it was losing loved ones, but it was also losing your day to day. So grief and loss comes in many different forms, many different ways. The pandemic created a lack of safety, right, across the board. So you start focusing on the things that you need for your day to day survival. And that creates a trauma response. It creates a lot of stress, and it creates unfortunate consequences on your mental health. And it's very important that we do talk about mental health. And I do believe that during the pandemic, we have more awareness about it, maybe than prior to, or at least I feel like there was more awareness to it. And I think that that's a really good thing because mental health has been stigmatized for a very long time.
Absolutely. I agree that there's no shame in getting help for these issues or problems in the brain, just like you wouldn't have shame for dealing with a broken bone or an infection or something. And I hope that more people are seeing that. A lot of the self-care activities that people might have engaged in previously, like going to the gym or going to socialize with friends, those weren't available anymore. And so, in addition to the acute stress of all the ambiguity and seeing all these terrible things happening in the news and the grief and loss, you also had less of your routine or normal abilities to self-care and cope and offset some of that thing. So it was both an additional input of the bad stuff as well as fewer outlets to manage it. Yeah, no, there's actually a really famous study done by Harvard. It was the longest longitudinal study of human happiness. And they found that there was a really strong association where people who had stronger, more quality, deep social relationships were happier. And that they concluded that the most important thing to making us happy is our relationships. And because the pandemic limited some of that, I think part of the solution to move forward is to be intentional about rebuilding and strengthening those social relationships, spending time with loved ones. I would add that having as much humor and positivity and gratitude in the midst of everything has been really powerful for a lot of people.
There were a lot of negative impacts of the pandemic, but there were also some things that I learned that I want to take with me going forward. And I want to reconnect with people that matter to me. And, I had a bit more time, being isolated at home, that I remembered these relationships and I started taking care of them and nurturing them and realizing that I wanted them in my life. So whether they're existing relationships, new relationships, or relationships that were there but maybe needed a little bit of nurturing, that's something I want to take forward as something that I'm going to be intentional about in my life. And I love that word, being intentional, because a lot of things that are self-care, like you said, they're not new. They're not these novel ideas. They're things that make us feel loved and cared for, things that rejuvenate us. And they could be as simple as looking at our physical wellness, like sleep and nutrition, as well as exercise. But they could also be things that, are food for the soul. So I think being intentional and adding to those relationships, the happier you are, the more happiness you can give to others.
There's a lot of literature that shows that the more that we, can contribute to others and find that good balance between taking care of ourselves and also contributing in a meaningful way can give us a sense of purpose and fulfillment.
I think it should give us a little bit of comfort knowing that we weren't the only ones who experience this global trauma, and so we can rely on each other in our relationships to move forward, to support each other, to keep us accountable, being more intentional about our relationships, but also being more intentional in supporting each other, and that leads to healing.
Yeah, I think a beautiful thing about the fact that so many of us have gone through this shared, difficult, traumatic experience is the possibility for empathy and understanding. That we now have more of an understanding that, hey, you've had a really hard time, so do I, and it's okay to not be okay. We're in the struggle together and we're going to support each other and have understanding and kindness for each other as we journey forward.
Trauma changes you, but so does healing. And so does striving for healing. And we may not be where we want to be quite yet, but we can strive for it. And if we all do it together, I think the global healing that we can have is phenomenal.